and welcome to the 145 Rural Podcast, where we are here to strengthen music careers and communities one song at a time. And now, here's your host, Jacob Wing. Yay!
Hey everybody, I am lucky enough to be right next to Mr. John Floridis, one of my personal heroes. And we're going to be talking to him and picking his brain today to see what we might pick up and learn, and he might share with us. He has been recording music, I believe, for over at least 2 decades. 6 full studio albums.
Yeah.
Last current one was October Surprise, I believe.
That's correct.
And he just dropped some knowledge on me that he might have one coming out soon that you might be able to look for.
It better be coming out soon. It's due.
It is overdue, but every time it's a joy.
Thank you.
I just like to put them on repeat, and my wife lets me listen to music while we sleep. So you're always a staple of the rotation.
Okay, all right.
And so when I told her, she's like, "Who is that?" And I told her, like, "Oh my goodness, I know his music, and I didn't know."
Oh my gosh.
It's always a funny way to find out. But you have been, like I said, playing music for about 2 decades. You've also been doing broadcasting and working with NPR in Montana here. And doing the Musician Spotlight.
Right, yeah.
And I believe you got an award in 2015 as the...
Yeah, we've gotten 3 of those awards.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah,
good for you, and more than deserved. Oh,
well, thank you. Yeah, they're called the E.B. Cranies, which are named after a historic figure in Montana broadcasting, and they're given out by the Montana Broadcast Association. And so the award was for best non-commercial radio program. So we've won 3 of those. And I happen to have had, well, I always have great guests, but I had 3 particularly great ones, and shows where really all you have to do is just stay out of their way because they had great stories.
I've noticed about that interview style is you're really good about, as soon as they have that hint of when they're going to move in, you step back and let it go.
Yeah. So yeah, I've been doing that. In fact, I've been doing that program for now. I think I'm entering my 28th year.
Incredible.
As host of that show.
Amazing.
Yeah. I didn't start it. Michael Marsalic started it.
I heard that you took it over.
Yeah, I took it over in 1997.
Wow. I had no idea. So, wow. Holy cow.
Which is not only a year after I recorded my first album, and lo and behold, not that far away from where we are sitting right now.
You're kidding me.
It was not that far. I mean, it was down in Corvallis.
Still, that is really close.
Yeah, a guy named Chris Stock. And I'm trying to think of what he called his studio, but Chris Stock was the guy. This was back in the days when as an engineer, you'll appreciate this, when digital tape and multi-track digital tape.
That's exactly when I got my start.
ADAT.
ADAT. And, I just had
what was the other one? There was ADAT, and there was it Tascam that also had a multi-track.
Tascam had they had 4-track, 8-track, and then they started going to the 16s.
Yeah. So that was the era. And it was kind of the beginning of the era of when independent musicians could record CDs, record and release CDs, and also the era where people would buy them.
I gotta say, you were the first artist I personally saw. I was able to see him right in this time, his first album, and at the end you were selling your CDs, and I could not believe the quality of what you were hearing. And at that moment, I knew, like, this is something somebody can do. That's amazing.
Yeah, and props to Chris. I mean, he was fantastic, and he just dove into it. He was kind of a hobby musician, but a musician on the side, and he just dove into it, and he had a good instincts and a good ear. And so around that same time, that was 1996 when I released This Year, which was the first album, and then the year after that, the next year was the year that I took over Spotlight.
Oh, that's amazing! I had no idea.
Yeah.
Right at that same time, I thought maybe it had come in later. Just in my, of course, just watching something from a distance, you make up this own narrative.
Yeah.
I had no idea that happened at the same time.
Yeah.
Amazing. And so, oh my goodness, the interviews. If you are just learning about John for the first time, go look up Montana Public Radio. They have an archive of some of his older interviews, and the wisdom and nuggets that are buried in there are just worth gold itself.
It's pretty. What's impressive is I'm not impressive, but
I beg you, screw.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of editing that goes on. I spend way more time editing myself than I do the guests, but it is stunning when I look back at the list of musicians, and they're musicians. You know, they are musicians. There are a couple of rock stars in there, but that's not really what it's about. You know, if they can be a rock star, but as long as they're a musician.
Right.
So like Colin Hay of Men at Work is one of the, like that one comes to mind. Bonnie Raitt, certainly. B.B. King is the one that always comes up as the one that just kind of blew my mind, where I realized this is really special, you know, what I'm doing. And to get to sit this close to B.B. King, closer probably, and have him be just an ultimate gentleman, you know, and talk about nuggets.
I've listened to that 3 times at least.
Yeah, so it's been a treat, and yet they don't. Some of the best interviews are not the ones that are the ones we think of as being the stars. Sometimes it could be a local musician. You know, I'm great friends with Tom Catmull. He and I've had a number of interviews. One of my favorite was a very close friend of mine, Jen Adams, who lives in the Bitterroot down in Hamilton, and now owns Rooted Music. And she and I met in Stevensville, not far from where we're sitting, somewhere in that vicinity I just described. And she was starting to pursue music a little bit, and the two of us, our careers kind of intertwined a little bit. And we did an interview one time, kind of at a cabin off in the hills in the Sapphires, and that was a great interview because we knew each other. And at some point, I kind of was going through my usual bit, right? Welcome to Montana Public Radio's Musician Spotlight. I'm here with Jen Adams, and Jen said, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "I'm starting the show." She goes, "Let's just talk."
That is a dream come true as an interviewer.
Yeah, I'm like, well, okay, and so we just kind of went with that, and but yeah, thanks for the kudos. It's been it's really a treat to be able to do that show, to be able to provide that. And I'm going to sound like an advertisement for MTPR, but
please do.
But it's a service for listeners. It's a service to the musicians, and to be able to provide that and be a part of that, it's really humbling.
I mean, a service is nails it. Just because the setup, the structure you guys have, where you are allowed to, you know, you play music at the beginning, an actual song, and usually a deep cut, actually, almost never like
that's a good observation. Yeah, and that is a little bit different. And a few years ago, Michael said, "Hey, let's expand it to an hour," because it had been half an hour,
right?
And that was in a way even more of a challenge, but you know, it just kind of opened things up a little bit, and gave us an opportunity to dive in a little bit more. But yeah, absolutely amazing work.
Love it, absolutely love it. I cannot recommend it enough. But let's transition to talk maybe just a little bit about you.
Sure.
And as we were talking about your show, and I've been able to pick up a couple things as I've learned what I like about music from you, so I stole a little bit of that. And then now as I'm starting to interview people a little bit more and more, I'm starting to learn from you in that. So your whole life is starting to be a little bit of an inspiration to me. But
oh, thank you.
The work that you've done, you do an amazing job when you're interviewing somebody about starting to ask them where they're from in the area, but also incorporating that into how that's influenced their work. So I want to turn that around on you. So let's talk about where you're from and how that's influenced your work.
Well, it doesn't take very long. Once you get to meet me, that I'll mention I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. And I live in Missoula. I lived in Missoula longer than I have any other place, but I'm from Cleveland. And I lived an equal amount of time in Fort Wayne, Indiana as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And pardon me, that's where I actually went to high school and ended up going to college. But Cleveland is that's like in my blood.
Right.
And I moved back to Cleveland after I studied music therapy in college.
Did not know that.
At Indiana University, and then did an internship in Denver, Colorado, and then moved. I kind of got my taste for the West, but before I moved out here, I detoured and went back to Cleveland. Involved a wonderful woman who was my girlfriend at the time, and
as it always does,
as it frequently does with men. Yes, it had to do with women, and so that brought me back to Cleveland. And I think going back there as a young man in my early 20s really brought home to me, by my own choice, I had come back to where I had been born. And I really kind of reconnected with that area. And well, what more do you want to know about Cleveland?
Just, is there anything in that part of the world at your time there that you think has influenced your music, you know, in the beginning or up to today?
Well, certainly there's a lot of things that come to mind. One is, if Montana folks have not been to Cleveland, Ohio, perhaps an analogy I've made is Butte. In the sense of, at one point, obviously Butte was the largest city in Montana.
Number one for a reason.
Right. and so much of it was fueled by mining, obviously. In Cleveland, similar thing, but with the steel industry.
Okay, yeah.
And so large immigrant populations in Butte was at its peak in the early 20th century?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Cleveland was at its peak in the mid 20th century.
Okay.
Both of those cities experienced large declines.
Of course, after the...
Yeah, and it may seem like apples and oranges because Cleveland, the metropolitan area is like 2.5 million, 3 million
but
people.
I see the... Especially, there's a good parallel there.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's kind of got a little bit of a chip on its shoulder.
Mm-hmm. That's a perfect description.
Both of those towns, and they're a little rough around the edges, a little cynical, little, kind of tough at the core. So, I mean, I suppose there's some of that in there. I also think, too, that a big influence during that time was that work I did in music therapy.
Okay.
And though I worked with troubled youth, so in a residential facility. And then I also did some work in Upward Bound, which is a program that helps with disadvantaged youth. So those experiences, I think, just formed me as a man in a lot of ways. In terms of how they influenced me musically, I'm not sure, other than in music therapy. One of the things that I developed during my work in that field was, everybody knew I was a professional guitarist. Even though I wasn't doing it full time,
right, I
was still a pro. And I realized, as folks were saying, well, you must use guitar a lot in your therapeutic work. And I said, no, these are young people that have like really low attention spans because of the circumstances they've been experiencing or been born into. Their tolerance for frustration is really small. It's hard to learn guitar.
It really is.
And so I was working with drums and piano and
things you can pick up, but
still
get a little bit of a result right away. Okay.
Doing therapeutic things with those instruments. It's not really about teaching them. But one of the things I realized was like, oh, well, wait a minute. I can use alternate tunings of the instrument to make it easy for a kid. This is like 6 to 16-year-old, so pretty broad range. But you weren't trying to make them into professional guitar players. You were trying to make that instrument accessible for them to be creative,
light that fire,
and find its way to a therapeutic goal. Sounds a little clinical. I tend to snap into clinical mode when I talk about this, but it essentially got me to being creative with the idea of retuning the guitar and working with that and kind of opening up my mind to new ways to use the instrument therapeutically, which I enjoyed myself in doing that for these young people. So then I would turn around and say, oh, well, what can I do? Oh, let me mess around with that on my own, see what I can come up with. Yeah, long-winded answer to tell you. I think that those things had a big influence on me, and also I think too, Cleveland, is very much an urban area. It's a big city, and yet I was also drawn to more rural experiences. Growing up, my family had a little place up in Michigan that was kind of secluded, little lake it was kind of my introduction to wilderness as I saw it. And so I was kind of drawn to those things. And it was around that time in Cleveland that a lot of the music I was listening to reflected that. I was kind of drawn to this kind of contemporary folk music, Sean Colvin and Patty Larkin, Suzanne Vega. The guitarist Michael Hedges was a huge influence. And though that's not what you maybe would call rural music.
No, I hear what you're saying.
I was drawn to the nature of an acoustic instrument. And yet I played in bands that like Motown cover bands, and I played in a group called Radio Free America. That's kind of like a funky version of funky in the best sense, like
right.
Sly Stone
Oh,
kind of
good, yeah.
funky Tears for Fears.
Oh my goodness,
sort of
that is a
vibe.
great combination.
Yeah,
I've never heard those terms together, but now I want to hear that.
It all had to do with this tremendous bass player that worked with us. But so I was kind of being pulled in these directions, and I think that ultimately that the music that I do now, even when I play, as we're speaking here, I'm about to play in a brew pub in Hamilton. I'm going to be playing an acoustic guitar, and I'm going to be running it through a bunch of pedals and effects. And at times it's going to sound like an electric guitar. So I've always kind of wanted that combination of those two factors, and for better and for worse. So, some of these albums I put out, it's like, oh man, can you just put out an album of instrumental acoustic guitar? Because people like that. And then you could go over here and do another project where you could play electric guitar. But when I first started out, I was like, well, I want to do a little bit of this. I want to do a little bit of that, a little bit of that. Because I don't know if I'll ever do this again. So I want to make sure people know I can do this,
Right.
My theory behind all that.
Oh, that is fantastic. And it's funny, you met right before this, we had just done an interview with Hank Donovan of Rattlesnake Cables.
Oh, gosh.
And I mentioned you, and his eyes lit up, and he started talking about this cable he'd built.
Yes.
To do just that, to split it. And that's funny you should mention that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, no. That guy, man, what a dude.
Oh, I could have spent all day talking to him. He is so smart and so...
Terrific guy, and what a great company, and... that's one of those things like, wow, that really happened. God bless America. like that's there are stories like that of a guy said, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to start a company making these great cables, and I'm going to run it out of my basement in Missoula, Montana, and it's going to be known all over the world.
Exactly. I'm going to keep all the jobs here. I'm going to do all American It's so rare anymore, but amazing.
Yeah. Great. Very cool.
All right. So moving on to the next question, I want to talk about inspiration, and you've done a great job, as I said before, asking amazing questions of all these artists and going deep on what inspires them and who inspires them. With you, I've seen a couple snippets here of like Hendrix stuff where you have a video of like Voodoo Child, and there's another one that was just amazing. And actually I wrote it down just in case. Little Wing.
Oh, yeah.
And amazing. I could listen to an entire cover album if you ever choose to do that. Just a fan request. We'd love to see something like that.
That's a cool idea. I think I did think about that at some point. Thought, well, yeah, could you do that and just do an acoustic guitar?
Oh my goodness, it'd be so good. Yeah. But stuff like that, I can feel your blues influence and maybe a bit of Celtic influence. But on top of that, who else has influenced you? What else has influenced you?
I'm just laughing because that pretty much sums up what I do. No, I mean, and it's funny because it's blues, and then all the things that came from the blues. And I don't know. I'm not someone who can be an encyclopedia when it comes to. I know the players, but as far as this is the Muddy Water style. This is more. My brain's going
like Chicago style or Delta style. Like
right. Yeah. Okay. Or this is Delta blues. This is Piedmont blues. I think I know the difference. I'm not like Marco Littig is a good example. The guy who does Mudslide Charlie. That guy is like an encyclopedia as far as that kind of stuff goes. A lot of it has come kind of through osmosis, and also from younger players. And I have delved back in, but I don't study it. I don't try to learn the style. I don't try to inhabit it. I kind of let it inhabit me. And yes, you're right. Jimi Hendrix was pretty much the portal for a lot of that stuff and everything that came with it. The concept of a funky groove. And so there's stuff that he did with the Band of Gypsies, which is very different than The Experience.
Right.
And beyond all the at the time, revolutionary idea of three black musicians working together in rock.
Right.
Scared the what out of
the establishment.
Yes. And the thick, deep grooves that branch of his music brought, that drew me in, and then that brought me to, I was joking about Sly and the Family Stone, but another genius, and everything that kind of came along with that. So that did have a big influence on me. And though I've not studied Celtic guitar, I'm crazy about Irish music. More to the point, all the things that music influenced. So again, it's almost like this balance of urban and rural and Celtic and Celtic influences and blues and African American influences, but not to be put aside is that I did study classical guitar as well.
Right.
So I immersed myself in the classical traditions as well. So yeah, that's you're kind of summing up a lot of what comes out of me.
Well, that's quite interesting. The only other thing I would even say, if I was to describe it to another person, there's a very percussive feel to your playing. So, and I guess I could say that kind of from the Celtic, but it's a really comes through in your playing.
Yeah, well, thank you. I think that well, boy, I was gonna say Hedges. Michael Hedges was a huge influence, and I almost was apprehensive about playing in that style, even though, again, consciously tried to not learn his tunes. In fact, there's one of my tunes called Dancing at the Rascal Fair, which
that's the first song I ever heard of yours. That's interesting.
Yeah, and I took that title with permission, or I guess you don't have to give permission, but I got permission from Mr. Doig, Ivan Doig, and contacted him about that great novel that he wrote and asked if it was okay to use that. And that tune started with me trying to begin to learn a Michael Hedges tune. And I got like 3 or 4 notes in, and then my brain just kind of goes off in another direction. Like, oh, that's not right. That's not what he was playing. But then it goes off, and I'm like, oh, this is something entirely different. And so yeah, I'm not good at learning note for note stuff. And so a lot of times the playing comes from just more the inspiration or me trying to do something and then failing at it. But so this kind of start in that style, when I did that back in 96, 97, he was still alive. Mm-hmm. And then shortly after that, kind of just as I was starting to, get gigs opening for and supporting for national touring artists and stuff, that was around the time he passed away. Mm-hmm. And so he was a huge influence in that. And a lot of musicians that have come along since then, I mentioned Sean Colvin is not as sophisticated a guitar player, I'm going to set this down, as Michael Hedges, but she propels her music with a real percussive attack on the strings. Patty Larkin, looking back on Richard Thompson, there's a lot of these players that do that. I suppose probably if I went far enough back, Richie Havens, even though again I was not consciously trying to copy that, I remember that captured me, the idea of an acoustic guitar and the percussive nature of it. So
that is absolutely mind blowing, because now I've listened to that song so many times in my life, and now that you just mentioned, even like this is kind of where the influence instant like sparks in the brain, like my goodness,
I could tell you exactly the tune that I butchered. And I have thought about like maybe I should have given him like a co-writing credit on that or something.
Oh, no, it's just part of music.
But I did talk with Phil Auberg about that, who was a tremendous pianist from here in Montana, and he was on the Wyndham Hill label and was a label mate with Michael Hedges. And I told him that story, and he goes, no, you've written something entirely different. Don't worry about it. So I'm like, okay. If Phil thinks it's okay,
right?
But,
that's cool. That is so cool, and that is just so insightful, amazing.
Hi there, and welcome to the ad break. We're just going to take a moment to let everybody know about our community of growing members, and if you'd like to be a part of that, just look at the info below, and there will be a click there for an email sign up to join in and get your voice heard. As well, if you're enjoying this content, please join our Patreon at patreon.com/145rural. There you can join any of our groups, and you can add to the discussion of what topics we will choose that will help you and hopefully future members of our groups, as well as join monthly Q&As and other such benefits. Again, that's patreon.com/145rural, and we look forward to seeing you there. Now, back to that regularly scheduled episode, and enjoy that content. Thanks again.
When in your life and in your journey did you realize that music was going to be a big part of your life? Was there a certain moment or a time period in your life that came about?
Great question. Sounds like one I might ask.
Where would I get such an idea?
There's so many moments. I think that one of the things that was uninteresting, I've always referred to this time frame. I was 10 years old, and I think I probably messed around with my dad's guitar. So I knew he was a guitar player, very simple guitar player. He was my dad. So he was like my first guitar hero. So I wanted my own guitar, and I knew that I wanted an electric guitar. And I don't know why, but it's like, well, I'm 10 years old. It's 1972. So,
Yep. Yeah,
60
You're
years
describing
old
my
now.
own journey at this point.
Yeah. And so that my parents signed me up for guitar lessons. I took 2 or 3 lessons. I was not good at it. I mean, I was like, okay, but at the time, okay, so I'm 10 years old. Since you have video, if you're watching this on video, you can see I'm not a very big guy,
Right.
but I was this big by the time I was damn near this big, but I was 10 or 11 years old. So
Really?
I was a big kid.
Really? Huh.
Yeah. So I was playing basketball, and at the little 5th grade, 6th grade team, whatever, I'm like, oh, this is interfering with basketball, and I wanted to play basketball.
Right.
So I set guitar aside. Then I took that same electric guitar, and eventually, rather than taking lessons, I found a way to plug it into a Zenith console, which was in the old days, it looked like a piece of furniture.
Right.
And you'd open up the lid, and here was the record player for vinyl, and you could have the receiver for radio and stuff. Somehow I found a way to plug the guitar into that, and it made this gloriously distorted sound. I didn't know it was distorted. I just
Right.
thought, oh, listen to that. And so I would just kind of make up sounds and just experiment, and bless my parents. I remember my mom having a party and coming around the corner and she said, "That's really interesting, John. Do you maybe turn it down just a little bit for having a party over here?" And I'm all this crazy stuff. But I feel like I've kind of gone away from your those moments. So
Right.
so yeah, I think that was actually a pretty significant moment in that the creativity was coming in, and that's no disrespect to the woman who was trying to teach me how to play guitar the right way, but my brain worked better with the creativity, and then I kind of found my way back to that. And I do remember as I got into adolescence, there were 2, we mentioned Hendrix, and I would go back and forth between Jimi Hendrix and the classical guitarist Andre Segovia. I was mind blown that a classical guitar could sound like that. And it was so evocative, and so everything was there, was just so perfectly composed. And so I would go back and forth between those 2 things. But I wasn't necessarily learning from that. Where I did learn was from Keith Richards.
Oh, you're kidding me.
And so get your yayas out. Live Rolling Stones, 69.
Right.
The best the Rolling Stones era.
Didn't see it coming.
Put that on. And because he played relatively simple lead guitar, as I kind of played around with it, I could match those notes. I'm like, oh, I'm playing the same note. I'm doing the same thing he is. So that led me to, I'm going to learn. So that was one time where I did learn the beginning solo on the live version of Sympathy for the Devil.
Right.
And then it moved into Mick Taylor. I'm like, okay, wait a minute. That took me a while to learn that
Right.
thing. So that's where that kind of came together. And then from those moments like that, then I realized, oh, I know where those other notes are. I can play around with those other notes. I don't have to play exactly what he's playing.
Amazing.
Yeah. And I think also at a certain point, I got, like we all are looking for, some kind of way to find your way as a person, in this case, a young man in high school, in junior high school and high school. And that became something I could be identified with. And again, earlier on, I was identified as a football player.
Right.
Because I was an lineman at the time. And so like that, I was at junior high school, I was the starting nose guard. And, I was like, I'm going to take that path, and I'm just going to keep growing, right? And I'll be a nose guard. Well, no. So if not a nose guard, then, oh, what's this? There's a whole other side that I could do. And so playing like a high school talent show and stuff like that, and then getting like, oh, this great response. Oh, so this is how I can put myself into the world, and it can come back to me. And wow, so maybe I'll kind of go this way. And I also had some really important people to affirm that along the way.
Right.
We'll go through everyone, but family and friends and extended family and stuff like that.
That's fantastic. Thank you for the insight on that.
Yeah.
All right, so this one's kind of a big one. We at this show that we try to kind of cater to newer artists that are just starting out, and people that maybe haven't quite caught their feet, so to speak, and started to keep that momentum. So something that might really help some of those newer artists or those people that are trying to find that direction is maybe hearing what success is to you, maybe what in the beginning success meant to you, and then now how it's changed over that time. What does success mean to you now?
Great question. I think that, and maybe I'll start that with the point where I decided I'm going to do this full time. I'm going to take it from the back burner to the front burner, because otherwise I'll be talking. Actually, I'm verbose, as you haven't seen already. Yeah, that's a tricky one. I think that as I experienced it, I can still remember having a distinct goal. I got into and made that decision later than a lot of musicians. So as I said, I studied music therapy. I got into that field, did social work kind of stuff. Moved out here to Montana when I was 30, and early on, my dad passed away, and that was kind of a moment of like, okay, what are we going to do here going forward? And I put that the idea of music on the front burner and said, I'm going to try this and go full time into this. And actually, that first album this year, the title came from my dad and I having a conversation, and he was well under the throes of lung cancer at that point. And the conversation we had was only a few weeks before he eventually died. And I was telling him, I think this year I'm going to put my music on the front. And this was even still when I had a job.
Right.
I'm going to put my music on the front burner. I'm going to try to record some of my own stuff. And I'm not going to wait to get into a band. I'm going to just kind of take control of it and go forward. And my dad quietly listened to me, and he said, as I recall, I think he said that last year. And so that, so I was like, oh, wow. At the time I was like, no, you're probably right. And then as he passed away, I realized, oh, I get it now. He was telling me, he knew he didn't have next year. And he was saying, if you're going to do it, get on it.
That is,
and so,
wow. That is
so
deep.
I did. And so where I'm going with that is I remember thinking, okay, I'll give myself 5 years, I had no idea what I was getting into. And I thought, well, I'm really good at this. And so things should just happen. And a lot of things did happen. But, certainly living in Montana, there were limitations to what was going to happen. So I think that very early on, I realized I've got to figure out what success is going to be. And what are some things that I can do? And I think it's such a big question to try to wrap it up in a quick answer is hard. I think that let me say this. I think there are innumerable ways to be not only a good musician, to be a great musician. And we have been conditioned in our culture to think of great musicians as ones who play stadiums or who tour the world playing theaters or concert rooms or whatever. And that is a great way. And generally, some of the very best musicians in the world do that. Sometimes they're not. And sometimes they're not, but they're propped up.
Right.
And we can go through all that. And conversely, there are terrific musicians who find other ways to be great musicians in their community, in a smaller sphere, in any number of ways. My partner, my girlfriend, in addition to being a terrific cellist, and we performed together, recently she was in the middle of watching a football game, and she got a call from a friend to come and play her cello for her aunt while she was passing away. And she did that in an instance. That's an amazing way to be a great musician. Oh, not in the sense that we normally think of.
No, that is perfectly summed up.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. And so that's what comes to mind. I think that, trying to determine what is, some people might set that 5-year goal and their brain and their way they live their life, that might be, okay, am I at that point where I want to be, how I had seen when I made that goal 5 years ago? Am I at that point? No. Okay, well, maybe I'll go back to doing a job and doing that. And maybe you have family responsibilities, whether they're a young family, you're a young person, you're as you said, people getting started. you're trying to start a family. You're trying to keep your marriage together.
Right. Yeah.
There's all these different things. Maybe you guys now you're into caretaking, maybe for an elderly parent. There's all kinds of life circumstances that you have to navigate. Then there's the concept of how you involve other people, and
There we go.
and it, obviously doing a solo thing, you have a lot more autonomy. There's all kinds of stuff that you can do within that. But if you want to play with other musicians and involve other people, whether it's being in a band or a group or projects, you got to find people who are at the right time in their lives,
Right. Yeah.
to make those things happen. And it might even be just for an instance,
Right.
or an instant rather. And I've had those kind of experiences. So for that, the success happened then, and I captured it. And yes, I might have thought, if I could just keep this going, and it couldn't,
Right.
for various reasons. The musician moved to another part of the country, or something. So a lot of those things factor into success. But I think that, I think in my own journey, one of the things I can say is that even now, as a 60-year-old musician who does a lot of kind of community stuff and playing mostly in Montana right now, I still am primarily playing my own music. And if I do play tunes by other artists, songs by other artists, they don't sound anything like the other.
No, they don't. But you can hear it. But your influence is you always hear the Floridis coming through.
Oh, thank you. Well, that's the idea. So that's a form of success. If I was doing the same thing and I was doing nothing but James Taylor and Paul Simon and the great male white guy singer-songwriters, they're great.
Right.
But if that's what I was doing, I think that would not be success. So I've had to kind of work around that, and I've chosen to keep doing it as I get into my 60s. And lo and behold, I feel in a lot of ways I'm better now at 60, about to turn 61, than I was when I was down here recording with Chris Stock.
Well, that's saying a lot. But yeah, I completely see what you're saying.
So then your measure of what is successful can change too. So I know that sounds like a really esoteric answer, but I think so much of it is. And you can make success like, okay, I'm going to release this album, and if I don't now it's like so many hits on Spotify.
It's all numbers
based,
right?
Yeah, and it's not even through sales or it's
streams or listens,
streams, all that kind of stuff. YouTube likes and people. That whole thing is just entirely changed since I started doing this. There's nothing wrong with that. I think that there's something to be said for setting concrete goals, because so much of music the rest of the time is not really concrete at all.
No, yeah, exactly.
It's
what a great thing to pass along.
It's so subjective. And I do think, here's one thing I would say, that I wish that I would have been able to do this more, is to do all the things I just mentioned. Do primarily my own music, or if I do covers, rearrange them completely. I wish that I could have found a way to do that and have that fit to some degree a particular genre.
Right.
So that I could get booked more.
Right.
Well, I mean, seriously,
it's a real struggle, eh?
Yeah, because like if when I was more active in trying to get into festivals and stuff like that, how would you define the genre? And I end up with kind of bluesy folk rock. Like I don't know what else to call it. And where do you put that? Americana? No, it's not Americana. There's too many notes. My improvisation stuff, it's not rootsy. It's more jazzy, really.
Right. Yep.
So it doesn't really fit into that blues. No, I'm not a blues musician. A folk musician. No, again, it's too aggressive. There's great singer-songwriters that I admire, and I'm like, I can occasionally fit my stuff into that, but it's not really. It's a little too aggressive. I improvise a lot. No, you're jazz. No, I'm not a jazz artist at all. Well, it's kind of classical. No, trust me, it's not classical. So I admire people who can do the things that I just said, but put them into a category where they can more easily work.
Right. And more marketable, if you. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and not that. Without compromising.
Exactly.
They're not selling themselves out. They're finding a way to do what they do, but find an audience for it.
Right.
And so many times people listen to music, seek out music, like we seek out our clothes,
Right.
And there's times when you feel like a flannel shirt. There's times when you feel like a fleece. There's times when you feel like a tank top or whatever. And I think a lot of times people go for that. So if they go to a show and it's a series and it's a singer-songwriter series, there's a specific thing they want.
Yep.
They would go to even like an Americana vibe, even though that's really kind of broad. There's a certain thing that they're looking for.
Makes sense.
And you see that in the stuff that's lined up. And I just think that it's a lot easier to do.
Right.
And you might be brilliant. You might be Bjork,
Right.
who blows everything out of the water. Like, oh, that doesn't sound like anything I've ever heard before. So she becomes a whole category
Its own
in and of
thing,
herself.
right? Yeah.
But that's rare. And
It is. Yeah. I understand. Yeah. That's
Yeah,
a
bless you if you
It's a
can do
good
it.
lesson for anybody coming up. Exactly. If you have to make that decision if you were going to stick to what you are and find your sound and develop, let that naturally develop versus chasing what's going to get you booked, what's going to get you views, what's going to get you likes.
yeah.
Struggle for all
Yeah.
of us.
It's an interesting journey.
One thing I want to touch on as we're kind of wrapping it up here is last month, one of my personal influences and a lot of people around here, George Winston, passed away.
Yeah.
And if you don't know who he is, you should take the time. He is like...
Oh, no, are you kidding me?
I know. He's like the Bob Ross of music. He just can paint a landscape.
That's a great analogy.
So good. And you were able to actually interview him once. Mm-hmm. And there's some questions that you asked him that I just wanted to kind of throw back at you. You were able to ask him about his, like, right when he was starting to record, like, his biggest albums, like Autumn and all that kind of stuff in 1980. And you asked him what he would say to his 1980 self.
Oh, God.
So I
had a feeling this question would come back to me someday.
What would John Floridis ask or tell to his 2000 self that's just getting his start and getting his feet on the ground?
Yeah, in the mid 90s, I would say a lot of things I just got done saying in terms of rethink how you're going to see success and learn to adapt to what that means and not try to get caught up in. For me, a lot of it was because I started when I was 30 years old. I felt like I was old back then. Like, oh, I'm so old to be doing this.
Time is weird.
Yeah, and now I'm thinking back on it. It's like, oh my gosh, that's ridiculous. So I think that would be a lot of it, is just redefine what success is. And for me, knowing it's the 60-year-old self going back to the 30-year-old self or 28-year-old self, know what works for you as a human being. Mm-hmm. So for instance, I definitely, since I started that journey, do more things outside of music. So I developed a passion for working in the art, gardening and landscaping. And I'm not really particular. I wouldn't say I'm good at it, but I love it.
Right.
I've always been tried to be, fit and take care of myself physically. Playing competitive basketball in my 40s, 50s, and 60s. Mm-hmm. I never realized how important that would be. Things like that, and also. Just connecting with other people and make time to set aside. You don't have to be working every night. Set some time aside and say, okay, I'm gonna make a priority that I'm gonna get together with these friends that night.
That is just pure wisdom.
And because you'll need, if you just, and too much of the time, I think it had been so pent up in me and kept bottled in until my early 30s. Like, okay, go. Right. And so now I'm going to be burning the midnight oil at every night, and I'm going to be playing every time I can get a chance to get a gig. And that's what I needed to do at that time. But yes, the 60-year-old version of me would say, back up a little bit on that. And
that's really good.
You're still going to be able to get to where you need to go, but don't burn yourself out.
I think we all need to hear that at some point. That's really good. All right, last question, and this one's just for me personally.
Okay.
I've been watching you for many years, and you always string your guitars, and you have those top three usually leave a little loop on top. Is that just a personal thing, just an aesthetic you like? What's going on with those strings?
I go back and forth with doing that. Mm-hmm. I think that is something I first saw Sean Colvin do.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And I thought, well, that's kind of cool. And I have chided some friends of mine who will just let the ends of the strings all over the place.
Right.
Like, God, that's dangerous. You're gonna
Lose an eye
stab
that way,
somebody. Yeah, exactly. But I think Sean is probably the artist that I first saw.
That is hilarious.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. All right. Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much for answering that.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you so much for doing this again. JohnFloridis.com if you want to see any of his current gigs or what's going on with him and anything like that. And just coming to talk to us is a huge
Thanks,
win
man.
for us. So
I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for your
And
time.
Thankful is coming out. That's the new
Thankful.
CD.
Be looking for that.
Yeah.
If you have any time, just stop and listen to it beginning to end. It's just personal life experience. It's amazing. Find a day, set it aside, listen to it. So thanks again.
Thanks, Jacob. My
Really
pleasure,
appreciate it.
man.